for joining us on our panel today, Don't Extradite Assange. I know many of you are well aware of this case and know the facts about it. Some of you maybe not so much. So let me give you a little bit of overview of what has gone on with the Julian Assange case. WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange is still in prison in the United Kingdom as the United States government attempts to extradite him to the US to stand trial on unprecedented charges of espionage for publishing truthful information in the public interest. The Trump administration went after Assange for the 2010 publication of Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, the State Department cables, and Guantanamo Bay detainee assessment briefs. These documents exposed war crimes, torture, corruption, and previously unknown civilian casualties. For obtaining and publishing these documents, Assange faces up to 175 years in prison. He has been jailed in London for 2.5 years since he was illegally expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy as he fights extradition to the US. In January of this year, UK District Judge Vanessa Barrett-Sir blocked Assange's extradition on the grounds that doing so would put him at a grave risk of suicide. In its final days in office, the Trump administration appealed that ruling to the UK High Court. In June, one of the key US witnesses, Sjursen Thordarson, recanted his testimony, admitting to an Icelandic newspaper that he had fabricated several allegations against Assange that helped form a conspiracy charge against him. Sjursen, already a convicted criminal, has since been arrested amid an ongoing crime spree. Now, earlier this month, Yahoo News reported that the CIA under Trump had drawn up plans to kidnap and even assassinate Julian Assange while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, and that the CIA's plans were so outrageous that even the Trump administration, the DOJ under Trump, expedited his prosecution. The Biden administration could drop the appeal and the charges at any time, but so far, the case is continuing in the UK. Assange's appeal hearing in London is scheduled for October 27th and 28th. The case could be further appealed to the UK Supreme Court and even the European Court of Human Rights. But he could also be denied appeal and extradited to the United States as early as 2022. That brings us to where we are today. I want to thank all of the panelists who are here with us who can give us added insight, not only on the Julian Assange case, but most particularly to what it means to all of us. So I want to introduce all the panelists and then I will ask them their questions. First of all is Danny Sjursen. He is a retired US Army major who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and as an instructor at the US Military Academy. He is the author of 3 books, including Patriotic Dissent and A True History of the United States. And he's also the director of the Eisenhower Media Network, a group of military intelligence and national security officials who provide independent analysis of US foreign policy in the hopes of rethinking those policies to make the United States and the world safer. Welcome, Danny. Colleen Rowley is a retired special agent with FBI intelligence. She served 24 years in the Bureau, and her actions as a whistleblower about the FBI's pre-9/11 failures led to her being chosen as one of Time Magazine's 2002 Persons of the Year, as well as the 2002 Sam Adams Award, which is given to an intelligence professional who takes a stand for integrity and ethics. Welcome, Colleen. And our third panelist is Matthew Ho. He is a retired, disabled US Marine Corps captain who served in Afghanistan and in Iraq with the Marines, the Department of Defense, and the State Department. When he wasn't deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war, police, and operations at the Pentagon and State Department. He resigned in protest in 2009 over the escalation of the Afghan war and has been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. Thanks to all of you. Danny, I'd like to begin with you. In recent decades, the government has ramped up its use of the Espionage Act to target both whistleblowers and journalists. As someone who served on the ground and later studied and taught about these issues, how would you assess the government's attempt to balance secrecy and security with our right to know?
Well, thank you for the question and for having me on this panel. This issue is broader than Julian Assange. I mean, I think that's part of the reason that we do this. So this is about principles over personality. Over time, I developed, sort of an affinity for these issues, for the right for Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, and other whistleblowers to be free. But that wasn't always a popular opinion within the military officer ranks. I mean, it was more in line, more in line with what Joe Biden said, right? A high-tech terrorist or whatever the quote was. But the reality is that these issues are issues of liberty versus order. And so later when I went back and taught at West Point, we would debate that. In fact, that was lesson 6 was, liberty versus order, but it was one of the themes. Mm-hmm. What's clear is that the United States has pushed itself so far in the direction of order, or what they say is order, but is really secrecy, denying us our right to know truths that determine, right? Truths that determine whether we're at war or not, whether we're actually persecuting, others, how we're killing, and we've gone so far in that direction is the point. The Espionage Act is interesting. When I was teaching this at West Point, there were 2 Espionage Acts. There was, sort of the Alien and Sedition Act, which was very similar, 1798. And then there's the actual Espionage Act, which is still on the books, which is absurd, from 1917. Well, both of them were used in the same way. The idea was that, we're either at war in 1917 or we're kind of in a quasi-war with France and England in 1798. And so therefore we have to have this Espionage Act in order to make sure that, there isn't sedition, there aren't people working for enemy governments, right? Foreign agents. I mean, this is the kind of talk we hear about Julian Assange all the time. It's the kind of talk we've heard from about every whistleblower. I doubt that anyone on this panel hasn't at some point, right? You could raise your hands, Matt and Colleen. Has anyone not been called a Russian agent or a Putin agent or something of that sort, or, over the years? But in reality, it's never been used for that. It's been used to persecute journalists, usually, of a different political flavor. And the point is that there's a long backstory to this. This always gets politicized. And now what's particularly interesting is that the US government is coming for a publisher. So not just a whistleblower, not just an individual investigative journalist or analyst, but a publisher. And again, principles over personalities. Someone could totally dislike Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning or any individual person that we're talking about. And what we usually see is this ad hominem pejorative attacks on individuals, like, this part of their character we don't really like. But it's funny that, we'll probably talk about it later, the Washington Post, the New York Times have not come out wholesale, just like they didn't come out wholesale during World War I under the first Espionage Act, right, which was still in place when it was first put there, because it's very much a situation like they said during World War II. First they came for the socialists and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the homosexuals and I didn't speak up because I wasn't homosexual. They came for the Jews. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, right, in Germany. And there was no one to speak up for me because I didn't speak up for anybody else. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all these places are going to rue the day that they didn't stand up in favor of transparency. And so, I mean, that's just my general take from a historical perspective. And as I watched my life fighting illegal wars over the course of 18 years, it became very apparent to me that I was Julian Assange, that I was every one of these whistleblowers, that I was my victims, that I was those victimized, and that we're all sort of one.
Oh, thank you. That was very well said and profoundly important. Thank you. Okay, Colleen Rowley. The last 3 administrations have ramped up the persecution of whistleblowers while also relying on leaks, including leaks of classified information, which violated the letter of the law, to manipulate public opinion. From a law enforcement perspective, is there a double standard? Do we have a different set of rules for people in power versus outsiders?
Well, I'm going to first pick up on something in that first question, which is that it's framed as secrecy and national security being on one side versus the right to know. This is a false trade-off. Because national security, and I wrote an article way back in 2010, and it was actually published. I don't think it would be published today on the eve of Julian Assange's hearing, but it was published by the Los Angeles Times, and it was entitled WikiLeaks and 9/11, What If? And the point here is that if we have a free press, and people in government spot an illegal act, if they spot something dangerous to public safety, a law enforcement issue, for instance, like 9/11, there were all those dots out there, you know, including my co-writer in that article, who was a guy that was found out that the airports, and especially the Boston airport, were letting weapons through. Now, he went to everybody. He went to internal affairs. He went to Congress. He went even to John Kerry, and he could not get the information out that all of the airports were so lackadaisical on security. And after 9/11, he became a whistleblower, and he testified to the 9/11 Commission. And of course, if the agents in Minnesota, if Bogdan Djokovic, if there had been an outlet in the press for getting some of those dots out, that terrorist suspects were being arrested in flight school before 9/11. They were actually being arrested already. The 9/11 Commission itself said if that had been the case, if that information had been shared with the public, 9/11 could have been prevented. That wasn't an opinion in an op-ed. That was the 9/11 Commission who said if the information had been shared with the public. So it goes back to the point where national security and the public's right to know are on the same side. You know, this actually is protecting our own security. The secrecy of the government, by the way, war crimes are not supposed to be secret. You're not even supposed to be able to classify an illegal act of the government. Of course, that's gone on, that's been swept under the rug. And Danny's point about the Espionage Act in times of war is very key here, because in a time of war, it's like everyone gets afraid, all this hysteria. We had even two of the Supreme Court judges at the time of the Espionage and the Sedition Act, which we now in history think of some of the best, you know, judicial wisdom in our whole history, Brandeis and Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and even they sided on the fact that you had to have a law. 2,000 people, by the way, were prosecuted under the Espionage Act for so-called disloyalty to the war. It was disloyalty to the war, because if you said that you shouldn't go fight in World War I, you were put in prison, and maybe in prison for 20 years, Eugene Debs, etc. And two of these judges even fell for it initially. But after a year or two, once that war fever, kind of wore thin, then this was all changed. And the Sedition Act was repealed in 1920. And then also the Espionage Act, in that whole time frame, the interpretation changed. And it was changed to, oh no, First Amendment is what matters. The truth is what matters. I'm just going to quote Oliver Holmes, just a couple of years after he had, got into this war hysteria and said we have to arrest people that were saying things against the war. He wrote in a opinion, a very important opinion, the ultimate good desired is better reached by these free trade in ideas, that the best of truth, the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. Okay, so what's he saying here is facts and truth are really going to keep us safer in the marketplace of ideas. Oftentimes, now I'm going to get to your question, the official narratives that officials who have had plans, usually these things like even going to war in the Mideast, all planned many years before 9/11. And so there are these agendas and these plans. They do not necessarily coincide with the truth. Okay, so what happens is you have those plans and you have a real ardent goal. The officials, they'll be very wedded to whatever goal it is that they want to sell. And in the case of wars, nothing is going to stop them. So what they do is the leaking, official leaking. A lot of this is like Scooter Libby with Judith Miller at the New York Times, is they go in and plant false info. So when we say leaking, usually we kind of think, oh, well, it's honest leaking, that it's leaking about a real document like Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. He leaked the Pentagon Papers. But a lot of this leaking is basically anonymous sources who are cozy with the reporters who now are, sucking up to power. And another example, besides the Scooter Libby one of planting false information, another one is the Guardian's reporter had this leak of information that Manafort had gone in to visit Julian Assange. There's not a shred of evidence for that. But guess what? It went into the media and everybody says, oh, that's an official leak. And many people believed in this whole Russiagate narrative. A lot of the Russiagate was put forth because, again, there were prior agendas in place as opposed to facts. And again, you go back to Holmes, it's the facts. This is why it's more important to have truth and facts, because this is what keeps us safer. Truth and facts will absolutely keep us safer. It will allow us to connect the dots before 9/11. Then very powerful officials who come up with, let's say that they even have a good goal. Sometimes they might just get real wedded to a goal that they become blind to the facts. Look, and torture is another example. I mean, the only person that went to jail for revealing the terrible war crime of the CIA's torture program was the whistleblower. It's the only person who went to jail. The rest of them, it's well known who put forth this program. Haspel, who shredded the documents, even though it defined a court order, a judge's order. None of them, they went up the chain and nothing happened to them, no accountability. And that's the problem right now. Official narratives, there's no accountability for leaking false info. And unfortunately, truthful facts now are like Julian Assange. No one disputes those were truthful facts. He is now facing extradition and further persecution for having published the truth.
You bring up something so interesting. It's this narrative that only officialdom can be trusted with these secrets, when in fact they're the last people who should be trusted with these secrets. That's not how America's supposed to work. And we've seen many cases, particularly since 9/11, where planes have not been brought down because of things that the other passengers knew to look for and knew to take action around. So the idea, and you also mentioned, Colleen, the idea of how government and the military so often these days will classify documents, when in fact they're not supposed to be able to classify a document for no other reason than that they find it inconvenient for us to know. But if a journalist says, well, what makes it classified? They say, oh, we can't tell you, it's classified. And there are millions of such documents as this. So thank you. Our third guest is Matthew Ho. Matthew, you resigned your State Department post in protest of the escalation of the Afghan war. What is it that policymakers didn't see or didn't get or didn't want us to get? We'll be interested to hear what you have to say. And might things have been different had we had more honest and transparent coverage of the Afghanistan war?
Thanks, Marianne. Thank you for hosting this, and to the Courage Foundation and the whole Free Assange movement. Thank you for letting me be a part. And to everybody who's joined us, I've noticed in the chat, we have people from all over the world. So thank you. And I'm sure, I hope that Julian is aware that so many people care for him, also value his principles as well. Your point about, it really comes down to, for me, what they don't want people to know. the transparency aspect of it. As you and Colleen were talking there, I was reminded that Neil Sheehan, who was a New York Times reporter and very much involved with the Pentagon Papers, Dan Ellsberg disclosing that the U.S. government knew that the Vietnam War was unwinnable, was a failure, et cetera, and lied to the American public and Congress about it. Very relevant, right, to this discussion about Julian, particularly the free speech, the press aspects of that. But Neil Sheehan, who is very involved with this, he said after coming away from his coming away from the Pentagon Papers with his understanding that the government does not classify things, it doesn't make things secret, it doesn't hide things to protect the American public from enemies. It's meant to protect the government from the American public.
That's exactly right.
When I resigned, I mean, we could be here all day talking about the Afghan and Iraq wars and everything. But when I resigned from the Afghan war, it primarily was the fact that the Afghan war was no different fundamentally than the Iraq war. You can make all kinds of arguments and we could talk about, this and that. But on the whole, there's no fundamental difference between the wars. And when I resigned, and after I resigned, I contacted the Washington Post because I found that in the fall of 2009, as we had this great debate in the US, and there was a terrific amount of media coverage on the war in Afghanistan at the time, something that has not been seen since. I felt that this aspect of the Afghan war, that it was no fundamentally different than the Iraq war, was being left out. And so that's why I contacted the Washington Post, and then I end up being on the media because of all of this. And I want to go back to the 2010 release by WikiLeaks of the helicopter murder video from Baghdad, where WikiLeaks via Chelsea Manning released footage of an American helicopter gunship murdering at least 10 people on the streets of Baghdad, including journalists, including children. They fired on a well-marked ambulance. Easily understood as war crimes. And I was on MSNBC, which is an American cable news network, and I was asked to speak about this. And I was on with a fellow veteran as well. And both of our reactions were, what do you think we were doing over there? We've been in Iraq for 7.5 years now, or however long it was at that point. We've been in Afghanistan for more than 8 or 9 years now, directly involved in combat. Our young men and women killing and being killed. What do you think was happening over there? And I give a lot of credit to WikiLeaks, to the anti-war movement, to people who have spoken out about this, for the way the United States military has, and the United States government has learned its lessons about these wars. People ask, what about the war in Afghanistan will the American government learn? And it already has learned its lesson. And this begins in the second half of Obama's administration, where the United States government shifts these wars in the Muslim world from being conventionally focused wars with plenty of young Americans bleeding in these wars, killing in these wars, being killed, to wars that are run by the CIA and Special Operations Forces, that there are a minimum of American casualties, which makes there be almost no American press coverage, which makes the public unaware, which makes the American Congress not care whatsoever about these wars, because at the end of it, it's black people killing black people, brown people killing brown people. It doesn't involve the Americans, even though the Americans are the ones who are instigating, sustaining, allowing for these wars, keeping these wars going. And what you see, though, is at the same time as this shift occurs, you see the Afghan war become the most unpopular war in American history. By 2013, the Afghan war is less popular than the Vietnam or Iraq wars ever were. And this is a direct result of the massive press coverage that went into the Afghan war in 2009, 2010, 2011. And again, the American government learns we have to keep these wars hidden. And with that comes an amazing drop in television coverage. There's a media critic named Andrew Tyndall, Tyndall. I suggest people look up his work. And he plotted out over the last 2 decades, the coverage of the Afghan war by American media networks, especially by the 3 major American broadcasters, ABC, CBS, NBC. Their nightly news, which airs 365 days a year, is the major or is the biggest source of news, particularly international news, for most Americans. And what Tyndall found was that in the years from around 2013 or so, up until this past summer with the retreat by the Americans and the victory by the Taliban in Afghanistan, Americans were receiving less than 5 minutes a year on average about the Afghan war. And this is at the same time as the Afghan war gets violent, more violent, and more violent, and more violent. Every year, record numbers of civilians are killed. Every year, the fighting gets up, expands, the Taliban gets stronger, et cetera, et cetera. And the American public is unaware because the media is simply not talking about it. The American Congress doesn't care. And this is a huge success for the American military, for the US government, for those who want to maintain and expand American empire. I mean, so I have to, the strength and the importance of what WikiLeaks, what Chelsea Manning, what Julian Assange, what others like Ed Snowden, what they have done has caused the American government to change how it operates, has caused the American media to change how it operates. The strength is there. And I want people who are watching this to understand that, yes, even though the US defense budget is now close to $800 billion, and that's just the base budget, the real American military budget, about $1.25 trillion a year, even as that goes up, even as we see Congress just completely beholden to the military industrial complex and to the wars and to, as the US government provides weapons to 70% of the world's dictators, right? So as there's this huge dissonance between what our elected leaders are doing, our government is doing, WikiLeaks and other organizations have really captured the pulse of the public. And that has resulted, as you suggested, Marianne, with this idea that we have to keep these wars hidden. With the transparency is what they are most afraid of. They know what's going on. And again, like I said, watching the helicopter video, the murder, what do you think we're doing over there? And I think that ties into the horror, the shock, the emotion that was felt by so many Americans when that family was destroyed by that drone strike at the end of August in Kabul. I mean, one of thousands and thousands of cases like that. But the difference this time was it happened in Kabul, and there were New York Times and Washington Post and CNN reporters in the area. And so it became like the helicopter, a gunship murder video. It became apparent. It became real. And that's most what they are afraid of, is that people understand what these wars are. And that's why they work so hard to keep them hidden.
Well, I really want to acknowledge all three of you because you are saying such important things, and I recognize, as I'm sure all of us do, the profound bravery on your part that you are doing so. It's already been mentioned that many of the people who are participating and are listening are from other countries outside the United States. This is the good news and the bad news. The fact that so many people outside America seem more aware, more perspicacious about what's happening with American military empire. We need more Americans to understand what's happening with American military empire. And that's why I want to thank all of you. Also, Matthew, with what you were saying, if you have media, television stations, media empires that have advertisers like Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, of course, they're not going to be doing any serious analysis of the military industrial complex. And once again, it's just getting this through. You know, I grew up in a generation where, because of the Vietnam War protests, certainly anyone on the left side of the political spectrum saw America's war machine as so central to any agenda for America being on track with our own moral values. These days, all of you are so correct with how the narrative has been shifted, and this idea has been created that in order for you to be a patriotic American, you side with people who are the least patriotic factors that one can possibly imagine in terms of their designs on American foreign policy and what that means for people all over the world. I want to go to the chat here because many people have been asking questions. The media is a joke. Nathan, also a follow-up for Colleen. You mentioned, Colleen, this is for you. You mentioned Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers earlier. Obviously, he was the source. And in this case, Assange is the publisher. Also, I want to say one of the things that I really appreciate about Matthew and Danny and Colleen is making it so clear that this is bigger than just Julian Assange. He's just one piece. Also, something else I'd like to say is let's add Daniel Hale to that list. He deserves to be there. Could I please have my glasses, Lauren? I would so appreciate it. Thank you. But beyond that, Colleen, can you talk about the parallels with WikiLeaks' release? He's going back to Daniel Ellsberg and WikiLeaks, and of course, Daniel Ellsberg has spoken about this, and our understanding of the Vietnam War. And I think that's another one. I know, Danny, Danny or Matthew, I think it was Danny, kept saying, this is just like Iraq. And that was my thought also. It's not just like Iraq, it's also like Vietnam in too many ways. During Ellsberg's time, and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the last decade. So, Colleen, I think he's just asking for your take about the Pentagon Papers, Vietnam, Daniel Ellsberg in relation to Assange.
There are a lot of parallels between what was going on at the end of Vietnam, towards the end, I should say, when Ellsberg woke up as an insider and, did have access to something the public didn't know, which is that this was a losing proposition. McNamara was going out and telling people that victory was just, around the corner. There are tapes where McNamara was actually telling Johnson, he gets out, he's on a helicopter, he's getting off, and there are White House tapes where that he was saying, oh, it's terrible in Vietnam. We're losing, we can't do it, nothing is working. But then he would go right in front of the cameras and completely lie. After a while, some insiders start to see this, like Ellsberg, and decided that, I have to be brave here and do the right thing. I think Assange is on a complete parallel. You see this out there and you see that the truth of things and it's so widely different from the official lies that you really have to do something. You don't have an option. I think all three of us will agree where you're in this whistleblower situation, you don't really, as a person, you're going to, lose your soul if you just go along with this death and destruction narrative, official narrative. So there's that. Then the other big parallel is that Daniel Ellsberg was one of that was setting a precedent when Nixon decided to prosecute him under the Espionage Act. That was really the first time since even the Supreme Court had realized that this should not be used to prosecute Americans who are whistleblowers, who are sources, whatever. They had realized that in the long period of time from the First World War. And so, Nixon says, no, we're going to set a precedent and put whistleblowers in jail, and then nobody else will ever speak out. The same thing, of course, is happening. Now, the same thing, but even a step worse, because Assange is a publisher. So there's a whole next step here where this is not just a whistleblower. This is ending freedom of the press. That's right. So exactly. There's that parallel. And the other parallel is that when a government goes after you, they do all these illegal things. There's a strong evidence that Nixon put out an assassination hit, the same thing that they were talking about with Assange on Ellsberg. And of course, the burglars went into his psychiatrist's office. So here we are now setting a precedent that the government can commit illegal acts on a publisher and get away with it. If the UK court does not see the light, or the Biden administration does not see the light, the precedents being set in prosecuting Assange are just going towards basically illegal chaos. This is illegal chaos on the part, and it's what Brandeis warned. By the way, Brandeis warned about this. When the government becomes the wrongdoer, it leads to anarchy and chaos. That was our Supreme Court judge that warned us, and we're on the precipice right now of that situation. I hate to be strong here, but I think it is that bad.
Yes, and Brandeis, of course, was also the one who said you can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have a democracy. You cannot have both. And of course, that's really what's happening here. Out of a $2.3 trillion spent on the war in Afghanistan, $2 trillion of it went to defense contractors. And you were talking just now about Biden seeing the light. I'd like to hear from all of you. Did you expect differently from Biden? Did you think that he would stop the requests for extradition? Did you have hopes? You know, it's so interesting because the other day the world was celebrating the fact that the Nobel Prize went to champions of free press, and everybody was talking about how fantastic it is. Meanwhile, right here, you have cases like this. So I'd like to hear from you, Matthew, from you, Danny, any thoughts about Biden and what you might have expected, what you do expect, and what you think is happening now?
Well, I'm not surprised that Joe Biden has, continued the prosecution, hasn't really changed the tune. Because I remember, and I think Matt does as well, and of course Colleen, another Nobel Peace Prize winner who I had staked all my hopes in when I was starting to turn against the war in Iraq during the surge in 2007. And that was, of course, Barack Obama. And Barack Obama utilizes the Espionage Act more times than any other president combined, mostly against whistleblowers, journalists, like as ever. And so I guess my point there is this is bipartisan indecency. Absolutely. And so there was a lack of surprise, almost, it was almost heartbreaking knowing that the Biden administration is most likely not going to take any progressive action on this issue, is not going to be champion of free speech. And there's nothing in his record that would indicate that he would. Certainly not in the vanguard leading any of this. And so, that was the big thing that turned me, to be frank, from being anti-Iraq war to being systemically anti-American militarism and empire. And that was that when Barack Obama becomes president, after I canvassed for him in southern Indiana secretly with a hoodie on while I'm still stationed at Fort Knox, and nothing changes and there's just more drone strikes. And then I get sent to the next surge in Afghanistan. That was the pivot. And so, no, I'm not surprised. And I think it shows that we have to fight all of the big parties, all of the mainstream media, not left, right.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things also is the military is being made to take the fall for this, but they had commander-in-chiefs who were civilians. If Congress is having hearings and really trying to get to the bottom of what happened in Afghanistan, they would also be calling President George Bush and President Barack Obama and President Donald Trump, and of course, President Joe Biden. And also, I think on that, Joe Biden has become very good at the Obama playbook, which is we'll say all the right things. So maybe because they're hearing us say what they want to hear, they won't notice what we're actually doing. Right after the evacuation and all this talk about how we're turning a page in U.S. foreign policy, and of course, right away, the endorsement of the Republican-led $24 billion addition to the U.S. military budget. The question becomes for me, we know that the three of you, and I'm sure others that you know, colleagues and friends, are doing everything you can to sound the alarm. I really want to acknowledge Nathan Fuller and all those at the Courage Foundation who are doing this. I think the question becomes almost a psychological issue. We've become inured to this. It's like the American people, why aren't we shouting? Like I said, in my generation, we were in the streets on this. We should be on the streets about these things, just like we're in the streets about BLM. Although even with BLM, this huge protest movement, larger than any other that we've ever seen, and no legislative change whatsoever. Now, I know that you yourselves are the articulators, you're the voices, you're the ones shouting in the wilderness, but do you yourselves have any particular ideas or insights about what needs to change, what we, the people, not only need to know, but need to change inside ourselves in order to make this a more massive movement, not only for Julian Assange, but for all of these whistleblowers and for a change in the U.S. military relationship to war and foreign policy?
Well, I think, with the politics of it, the politicians so often respond to carrots and sticks. And you're connecting, Marianne, Julian Assange to the issues that surround him, freedom of the press, what our government is doing, war crimes. That does connect to Black Lives Matter. That does connect to climate change. This is, the United States elected a man who said nothing will fundamentally change. So we should not be surprised when Minnesota police are paid by an oil corporation to beat, gas, shoot, imprison water defenders, and that pipeline is getting ready to start operations. We should, and a pipeline that is going to have the same carbon footprint of as what, 50 coal-fired plants or something like that, 900,000 gallons of oil a day. So this is all connected because we are seeing that regardless, like you said, Marianne, about what they say, their allegiance are to these established interests. And how do we make them pay for that? Whether, what is the political strategy to punish Joe Biden and other Democrats for not doing it? I mean, we have a healthcare system that was killing thousands of people before the pandemic. And now with the pandemic, we've got this healthcare system where we know that hundreds of thousands of people have died because of a lack of access to healthcare. And there is no discussion about expanding healthcare access. So it is not the subject that we're here to talk about today. It's the larger issue we have with our political system. And so how do we get a political movement to cause the Democrats to respond to these issues? Because right now there's no punishment. There will be no punishment for Joe Biden allowing Julian Assange to be extradited and die in a maximum security prison in the United States. Right, there will be no punishment for Joe Biden for that under the way we work right now. There's no punishment for the fact that we've got 700,000 dead from this public health crisis, and we're not doing anything to address it other than rely on vaccines and masks. We're not getting at the underlying problem that people don't have access to healthcare. We have a system that is inefficient, that is profit based. Of course, we've got the most amount of dead in the world because of this pandemic. Look at our system. Right? I mean, climate crisis. So how do we punish these politicians? And on the other side, is there a way that we can, if in the short term, before we can get money out of politics, can we create our own political action committees? Because I think to get money out of politics, unfortunately, you need money to get money out of politics. I mean, you could tell us better than anyone else. You're a part of the race, right? I mean, you know how important money is, just so people, otherwise, how do people hear about you? How do they, I mean, so yeah, there's a lot to it, but it comes down to, like, for me, and there's not an easy answer, but we have to find carrots and sticks.
Well, I'm so glad that all three of you are acknowledging that intersectionality, the connection, whether it's big oil, big pharma, or military industrial contractors, it's all the same aristocratic takeover of the US government by these huge corporate behemoths. And it's not only a profit-making healthcare system, it's not only profit-making energy system, it's profit-making foreign policy. What used to be a crime, war profiteering used to be a crime. It is now an industry. And when you talk about punishing Joe Biden, are you kidding? The main raison d'etre, supposedly, for the existence of the Democratic Party, the reason we're supposed to vote for the Democratic Party is because he's not Trump. But in the case of Julian Assange, the case of the forever war machine, even though they're moving things away from, have left Afghanistan, Biden is no different in too many ways. Lloyd Austin was a Raytheon board member. You were mentioning Gina Haskell, et cetera. But then on the other hand, Matthew, you say, how do you punish them? Punish them. They're not looking to be punished by the voters because they are so paid by the lobbyists for Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Boeing. And I think that panels like this, voices like yours, have got to be the answer, because the American people have simply got to wake up. And when you say, how do we punish him? We just have to stop believing him. And I'm not making this about him personally. I think his heart is in the right place in many ways. I certainly would vote for him against Donald Trump, et cetera. But, I almost feel like, and so much in my work, when I would be talking to women who kept going back to abusive men, it's the same psychology. Honey, he's lying to you. Too many people have not yet accepted the sociopaths in charge here. These industries are being run by people who have no remorse. It's like Danny was saying, or Matthew, maybe it was you. Everybody's so upset because of the people who died at the airport. What do you think's been going on there for the last 20 years? And I think that for the American people, the cognitive dissonance is so great for us to actually accept some really bad actors are in charge here. And they're the ones wrapping themselves in the flag. And as you were saying, Colleen, they're the ones who are wrapping themselves in the notion of security. They're taking care of us. I'm gonna put something out that you, I don't know if you have anything that you want to say about it. Anybody have any ideas, opinions, anything you want to share about what we're all seeing happen in Taiwan right now with China and its airplanes in the Taiwanese airspace, and how you think the American military and the defense establishment might be handling all this? You have any thoughts about what's happening now or what's going to happen with any of those things?
Well, speaking of a haven of sometimes sociopaths, I wanted to say a few things about sort of the military angle on this, and I think I'll be able to tie in some of what's going on, you know, the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This sort of like sort of battered relationship syndrome with our politicians. One of the ideas is that when you put a Democrat in charge and he ends the war in Afghanistan, that, well, ship shape, right? We're all set, progress, things are being done. But of course, for the war industry, which correctly, Marianne, you mentioned, in the Senate, they used to call these people the merchants of death in the 1930s. A Republican senator from like the Pacific Northwest was saying this. It was actually a fairly popular opinion after the First World War. I've said it a million times, and I think most people may not see it, but it's more profitable to have a Cold War or a potential hot war that, by the way, could end the world in an afternoon when both sides have nuclear weapons. That's more profitable for Raytheon and Lockheed and Boeing than counterinsurgency, because rifles and paying experts to teach us Arabic a little, right? And even the bombs that we drop there are nothing compared to F-35s, littoral ships, aircraft carriers. The Navy and the Air Force in particular love the pivot to Asia, right? Which is another Obama legacy. They love this idea. And this saber rattling that's going on over there. And this is not like any sort of endorsement of Chinese foreign policy. We don't even have to go there. This is about who profits from the saber rattling that we have in the South China Sea, right? It's named the South China Sea. I mean, could you imagine the Chinese Navy saying that not only should we have naval parity, but we require naval supremacy in the Caribbean, in Long Island Sound. I mean, that's how far we've pushed a lot of this. And the question is, if we're not looking at a diplomatic solution to something that can't be won, not really. You can't really win a war in the Baltic against the Russians. Even if you win, you lose. You can't really win a war against the Chinese in Taiwan, because even if you win, you lose. The stakes are too high. But we keep doing the same thing. And I wonder if it's a lot of the same reasons that Biden hasn't changed policy on Julian Assange, which is that the people who profit, the people who really profit, don't care. This is profitable to them. Missiles in Saudi Arabia for a fake war against Iran, more ships for the Navy to go into the South China Sea and demand at BRs and escalate these things. That's what the real profit comes from. And of course, they control most of the politicians, and they control the media, and therefore the conversations we're having right now can barely break into the public sphere, and I can't even be that mad at the public. When I was first leaving the military, I was really petulant, you know, like, why don't people get it, right? Everyone should be listening, but how would you even know? And I think that that's part of the reason this is important. And so I guess my only statement on what's going on in, you know, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, is that this is more of the same. This is actually the preferred profitable enterprise for the military industrial complex.
Well, I have a couple questions for you. First of all, why is it profitable to them, though, to keep Assange in prison?
Well, I think the only reason it's profitable is because he puts their profits at risk through the exposure.
If he gets out. That must be what they're afraid of, that if they let him out, that he'll take up where he left off.
Or set a precedent for others.
Yeah. Secondly, I want to ask you something. This might sound a little like an unsophisticated question, but Taiwan is an ally. I mean, isn't this situation a little bit different, though?
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan is a partner. I mean, Taiwan's not an official treaty ally. I have a lot of sympathy for places like Taiwan, Hong Kong.
Me too. Me too.
Weavers. Like I actually do. I think the question becomes, what's realistic? What is a realistic approach, and is there a military solution? I used to ask my cadets when I was teaching. I said, how many of you know that Lithuania is a treaty ally? Taiwan's not. Taiwan's not actually a treaty ally. We don't even technically recognize them anymore, right? We officially recognize
because
China.
Of our relationship with China, though. Yeah.
Exactly, which is largely based on trade, and that's like the big secret.
Right, of course.
To talk about, but it's a similar situation to something like Latvia. We are actually treaty allies with Latvia. We have to go to war by law, basically, for Latvia's independence, and up to and including nuclear war with Russia. And it's the same question for Taiwan. I would ask the cadets, I say, did you know that we have to? And do you think we would? And do you think we should? And all three of those are different questions. So while I'm not endorsing policy on China's end, I think that this kind of militarized response has its limits. And if we haven't learned the limits of force after 20 years of hopeless war, really 60 if you include since Vietnam, then I think we really need to get our own heads examined and look for other solutions to the extent that there are any.
Any of you have any things you want to say about nuclear issues?
Well, I think your point, Marianne, before about the sociopaths in power, it made me pull off this book off my shelf, The Pathology of Power by Norman Cousins, which people haven't read. It was written about 35 years ago. I can't recommend it enough. The interesting thing about this copy, though, is that the foreword was written by George Kennan. George Kennan was a senior State Department official who headed the Office of Policy Planning, which is the State Department's top tier future plans division. Basically, they're the people who sit around and think big strategy, or so that's what they used to do. I'm not really sure what they do anymore. But Kennan was basically the man who came up with, in the mythology of American foreign policy and diplomacy, Kennan is the man who comes up with the containment strategy for the Soviet Union. So becomes very famous, becomes known as the old dean of American foreign policy. Yet by the time 1987 comes around, he's writing the foreword for a book about sociopaths running our country, running our government. So this connection can't be denied. The fact that we have spent how many trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons that we will never use, or I shouldn't say never use, we can never use. I think to tie this to the point about China, if you talk to people who are involved with war games on China, first, the United States always loses. And secondly, more often than not, those war games end in nuclear exchanges. We know now that a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan is enough to end life on this world as we know it.
As we know it.
I mean, you need less than 1% of the world's nuclear weapons to be fired at Hiroshima-sized levels, which are as much smaller than levels.
Which are like little pinpricks to what we have today.
Compared to giant artillery shells. Exactly. And that's enough to bring about a collapse of the world in terms of nuclear winter and starvation and so on and so forth. And yet we have these, and we're going to spend $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years upgrading these. And so the sociopath, how do we get to this point where these are the people who lead us? And because it's so much of it, and this goes to another thing, and one thing I note all the time is that our politics are so devoid of emotion in terms of positive emotion, so devoid of love, compassion, relationships, support, partnership, right? I mean, but our politics are full of the greed, the anger, the hate, the profit. Those things are okay to animate people. When members of Congress vote with the military-industrial complex, no one thinks twice. But if someone like Barbara Lee or Dennis Kucinich stand up and say, no, we can't have this, those people are the ones that are considered inane or crazy or have some ulterior motive. So it goes back to your points, Marianne, which I take again. And I really recommend, again, Pathology of Power by Norman Cousins. Yeah.
Worth mentioning that we have recently ordered 100 B-21 Raiders, everyone. And this is a bomber that will carry nuclear as well as conventional bombs. They're $500 million each. And as Matthew said, you drop 5 of these, it's over for life as we know it. You drop 10 of these and the planet, I mean, forget human life on this earth for what, 200, 300,000 years. And also, as Matthew said, you keep building these, your chances become more and more diminished that something somewhere won't happen. One of these things won't go off. It's insanity. Also, I'm sure you all know that all over the internet yesterday were these pictures of these robot dogs that now have assault weapons on top of them. And I think it's very naive of us to believe that those wouldn't end up someday in domestic police forces. They should be outlawed. They should not even exist. And as Matthew has been saying, it's the insanity that is behind all this. This is insane. And also, having had some experiences in this myself, when you start talking about these psychological issues, these emotional issues that are really at the core of all this, that's when they definitely want you out of the conversation, because protecting their narrative means that you will suspend any deeper conversation about what the hell are these people thinking? This is insane. And so I appreciate what Matthew said. We have to do, President Roosevelt, before he died, wrote a speech for the Jefferson Day ceremony that I think it's so interesting. He wrote the speech, but he didn't live to give it. And in this speech, he said, we need to do more than end wars. We need to end the beginnings of all wars. And the beginnings of all wars are in our heads. That's why when Matthew was talking about, Barbara Lee was talking about Dennis Kucinich, and also I and others have talked about a Department of Peace. If you have $780 billion spent on the military, but you only have, $40 billion spent on your State Department and only $17 billion spent on things which actually help to prevent war by increasing the incidence of peace and harmony, then what chance do you have? And we've got to intervene. And we can't just intervene. All of you have been talking about the transactional changes that we need. But I appreciate that Matthew brought up that we need transformational changes as well in our own thinking. And we must be willing to stand up and say, this is insane. This is insane. I really want to thank all of you. And Nathan has asked me to ask all of you to comment also on the CIA plans that have been revealed to kidnap Julian. We do want to bring it back to the case of Julian Assange. This is something all of us can do to keep this conversation alive. We do not want the United States to extradite him. We want Joe Biden to drop this. And once again, the CIA had drawn up plans during the Trump administration to kidnap and possibly kill Julian Assange. So Colleen, Matthew, Danny, any final comments that you'd like to make, and specifically if you'd like to comment on what's been revealed about the CIA plans regarding Assange? Yeah,
I'm going to go back to that point, but tie it in with the fact that the American public has, turned into zombies, whatever you want to say. They've been like little frogs in the water, and slowly now we're at a boiling point, practically looking at the danger of nuclear war. And it goes back to something that Karl Rove, they gloated after 9/11 that they, quote unquote, make their own reality. We're an empire now, and we can make our own reality, which means that they can basically manipulate public opinion through the media. And that's where the Julian Assange and persecution of WikiLeaks comes in so vastly. I have to imagine that there are people, even in the Department of Justice, maybe even in the back mind of Merrick Garland, and maybe some of the people that work for him, that have to understand that what Brandeis warned about, when you get to be an empire like this, and that the government is doing illegal things, like infiltrating and spying on the Ecuadorian embassy, the very fact of using extraterritorial jurisdiction under the Espionage Act on a non-American citizen is illegal. That's illegal. There's been so much illegal things going on here. And what they warned about is the Sorrows of Empire. That was a famous book. When you get to be this empire and you think you can make your own reality, I think reality is going to interfere with that goal. I really do think that, unfortunately, and we are all going to be victims of, I hope not nuclear war, but we're victims of this making your own reality. The press, if we don't have a free press, and this precedent is allowed to stand, which is putting an independent, investigative, person willing to publish the truth. If that stands as whatever, there's really no hope for any of us in the United States. The bottom line, somebody in Department of Justice, hopefully read your Oliver Wendell Holmes and your Brandeis and do what the Obama administration decided, that you can't prosecute under the First Amendment. It's not possible without the government becoming the wrongdoer. That I'm going to cease.
Absolutely. And state crime, state-sponsored crime is still crime. You talked about Nixon. Nixon said if the president does it, it's not illegal. That's the way these people act now. Well, it's not illegal because we're doing it. No. You're doing it is worse. The fact that it's illegal and it's you doing it is worse, not better. Yeah. Thank you, Colleen. Matthew, final comments?
I noticed, and I'm sure other folks noticed with that news story about the CIA was going to kidnap Assange and have a shootout with the Russians, and the insanity of that, right? If anyone knows where the embassy is, and that Harrods department store, one of the biggest department stores in the world, is right there. I mean, it's on the same intersection. I mean, this is a crowded commercial district. I mean, it flooded with people most of the time. That this is the thought process of these people. It's just, you'd have no respect for them. And you should have no respect for them. The thing about that news story, which was repeated, so breathlessly because it's so exciting, very James Bond-esque, or, like the TV show 24 or whatever, is that if Assange is convicted and press freedom is impacted the way we believe it will be, a story like that becomes illegal. A story like that becomes impossible to tell. And it's just not about the war crimes overseas that are so important, that by itself need to be, for if no other reason than for the moral legacy of these wars, to tell the truth about these wars, to give the nameless and voiceless victims some form of name, some form of voice. But also, too, to connect, say, Marianne, to what we were talking about with Black Lives Matter. Now, if the police shoot somebody and it's part of an official investigation, how does any local newspaper journalist cover that? Because if you think that somehow there's going to be some kind of firewall between what the Pentagon does and what your local police departments do, and journalists and the public's ability to have transparency and oversight over that, you're kidding yourself. So how much do you know? How many people were out in the streets after George Floyd was killed because it was just enough? I've seen too much. I am going out on the streets now, right? I mean, it particularly for people outside of the Black community who weren't living, enough. I've seen enough. Well, you take that away. You take the media's ability to do things like that because it's part of a government investigation. It's an official police business. It's part of whatever excuse. These are the very real consequences if Julian is extradited and found guilty in this country, let alone the moral crime of it all.
Absolutely. And we have to take a stand. Stephen Donziger, the fact that Chevron is prosecuting him using a U.S. court of law. When we see these cases, whether it's Assange, whether it's Donziger, whether it's Daniel Hill, we have to see these things. We, the people, have to see these things. Danny's story at the very beginning of this was the famous story. They came for the labor unionists. I didn't say anything. They came for the communists. I didn't say anything. They came for the Jews. I didn't say anything. Now they're coming for me and there's no one to speak. If we don't speak up for Julian Assange, if we don't speak up for Daniel Hill, if we don't speak up for Stephen Donziger and others, Danny said it earlier, the New York Times, for instance, will rue the day that they didn't take a real stand. And it's also been mentioned, Colleen was talking about the fact that Obama didn't choose to go after Assange because he thought, what, am I going to go after the New York Times? Well, I think that awareness and information is power, and our panelists have certainly given it to us today. I'm so grateful to you. Danny, final words and also an insight about the CIA plot to kidnap and assassinate?
Yeah, absolutely. And briefly, but I think this is important. If the CIA was planning to kidnap Assange, that doesn't surprise me because we're living in a rogue state. I mean, I grew up in the Army hearing about rogue states, North Korea, Iran, right? But But if you actually look at the actions of the United States and who has killed more people, right, in illegal wars and taken actions against its citizens, I mean, we have to qualify, right? And so that doesn't surprise me at all. But of course, if Assange is extradited under quasi-legal, jujitsu or whatever they want to call it, that would be kidnapping. That would be kidnapping. So in a sense, I mean, the CIA doesn't even have to do the job because the judicial system is going to try to kidnap him. And I just, my final words on it is that when our right to know is denied, and Matt made up such a great point. If this flies, if Julian is extradited, if he is imprisoned for life, if this is allowed to fly by all the mainstream sources and those in power, we won't hear about this again. And we already know what can happen so far. Just take the last 20 years when our right to know is circumscribed. What do we have? We get wars started, nations invaded, innocents killed, war crimes committed, civil liberties violated, privacy just revoked. And so we know this. And I guess for me, it was, my own losses of my soldiers, of my own emotional health, and the crimes I was complicit in way more deaths overseas led me to understand one thing, that my government and all authority figures in my life system had failed me and sort of failed this citizenry. So this time I decided I'm on the side of the quote lawbreakers. Of course, it turns out that in being on the side of the quote unquote lawbreakers, I'm actually fighting against the real lawbreakers, which are the powerful, which it turns out to be our own government. I think in these times, in times of crisis, patriotism involves breaking the rules. And I'm just glad to be here. And thank you, Marianne, for hosting.
God bless you. I agree with everything you said. And I'm so grateful to all of you. Once again, to Nathan Fuller, to the Courage Foundation. Don't extradite Assange. You too can help. First of all, remember Matthew Ho, Danny Sjursen, Colleen Rowley, these people have written books. You can find them on the internet, support them in the work that they do, support the Courage Foundation, and don't forget, as often as you can, that hashtag Free Assange. Thank you to all of you. I do believe in the American people. I just want to say, we just need more political voices who support the real nobility and dignity and conscience of the American people. I'm still holding out for a miracle here for this country. And I know that you are too, or you wouldn't be doing the very brave work that you're doing. Thank you, everybody. All our best. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.